Good morning. I was so pleased to be asked to introduce Reverend Karen Johnston today because by doing so, she and I are completing a circle that started almost 5 years ago. You see, I first met Karin when she came to my previous UU church, First Parish Church of Groton, Mass, to be our student minister. Over the next 2 years, first as our student minister and then as our sabbatical minister, Karin showed herself to be kind and wise, fierce and funny, and willing to follow as well as to lead. In short, she was everything we could want in a minister. It was hard for me to leave Massachusetts just before Karin was ordained, but New Mexico called, and Karin helped me through the transition with loving compassion. I say goodbye to Karin and my beloved community in Groton. And now I'm so pleased because I get to introduce you, my new beloved community, to Karin. She grew up in Oregon, lived in Western Massachusetts for a couple of decades while raising her children, and now finds herself in, of all places, central New Jersey, where she is the settled minister at the Unitarian Society in East Brunswick. Karin is the recipient of the 2018-19 Dana Greeley Prize for a sermon she wrote on the migrant crisis. Sadly, we're not going to hear that sermon today, but maybe we'll have her back and she'll do it for us. And while on vacation, she likes to preach in new UU pulpits, and she's thrilled to have the chance to do that here. So please join me in welcoming her.
I want to start with gratitude. Gratitude for the yes that Reverend Angela extended to me when I said, hey, I'm going to be in New Mexico. And gratitude for the chance and the generosity of Andrea's introduction. Gratitude for this music. I was entranced. And gratitude to be with you here today. 2 decades ago, my grandmother was dying. She was on hospice. And I spoke to the coordinator of her hospice, and I said, how is she doing? And I wasn't asking medically, I was asking emotionally, I was asking spiritually, and here she was, having to balance my grandmother's confidentiality and my grief that was coming up as curiosity. And so, in a very strategic and kind and politic way, she said, as we live, so we die. This was unfortunate for my grandmother, who barely topped 5 feet, but scared the bejesus out of anyone she met, including all of her progeny. Her insistence on control, on her rightness in the world, meant that dying did not come easy to her. But I'm not here to tell you more about my grandmother. I'm here to tell you about another older woman whom I also loved. I'm here to tell you about a different way to encounter dying and death. I'm here to tell you about someone who, when the time was right, could not wait to be the hummingbird. I want to tell you about Eleanor Lee Hawkins. So the process of becoming a minister, probably you know this, we have to go before the ministerial fellowship committee, a panel of very intimidating but really kind people who want to make sure the right folks become ministers. And at the time I was going through this and about to see this august panel, the word on the street was, one of the common questions that they would ask would be, who would you choose, which Unitarian or Universalist or Unitarian Universalist, as your hero, one for each of the past 4 centuries? Well, I had to struggle and figure out who it would be 4 centuries ago. I knew for the 21st century, my shiro would be Lee Hawkins. So I tell you about Lee because she's my shiro. I tell you about Lee as a talisman for myself, an act of my own practice of befriending death, as one of my own inelegant attempts to live into the line of that poem that Andrew read for us so beautifully, the tenderness yet to come. That poem is our reading today because Lee left written instructions for me to read it at her memorial service. That was 5 years ago. Lee was indeed that hummingbird. A full decade before she died, so it's 2004, and her husband was dying at home, and he called out to Lee from the bedroom, and he told her that it was time. He was on death's door, and Lee went into him full of devoted love. They had been married for decade upon decade, and they were still effervescent in their adoration for each other. And so she went in and she sat on his bed and she asked, Raj, what's it like? Minister or layperson, churched or so-called unchurched, organized or free range, death is the great leveler. And there is much for us to learn and gain and be enriched by stories of those who invite us into less fear about death. So I am telling you about Lee because I want her witness in the world, dead as she is now, to enliven and expand your notions of what it is to be human in this aching world that always, without exception, ends in death. And in this way, I want to make good on the promise that I made to her to tell the story of her death, which in many ways is telling the story of her life. Born in California, Lee lived much of her life on Staten Island. She was active in the UU congregation there, and then for the last 20 or so years of her life, she moved up to Northampton, Massachusetts, which is where she and I were both members of the UU congregation. And as I understand it, for most of her adult life, Lee spoke of her intention to be aware and in control at the end of her life. And so, yes, that means documents, a will, advance directive, things like that, but conversations too, with all of the members of her family, which extraordinary measures to take and which not to take, her vision of what a good life is and also what a good death might be. So perhaps control is the wrong word, it conveys the wrong meaning, because she was not talking about that typical way in our society. We talk about controlling death, which is to keep it at bay. By controlling death, I mean she was in relationship with death. She was willing to surrender not any old time, but when the right time came. This intention was part and particle of her deeply rational, deeply kind, deeply political being. And as she gained years, having not succumbed to the vagaries and surprises and tragedies that so many of us humans experience as we get older, she prepared for the possibility of dying in old age and on her own terms. And this intention was not born of a depression that can sometimes accompany the aging process, which is so much about losing things, losing capacities, losing friends, losing out on experiences in the wider world. Though she did anticipate this, and it influenced the timing and texture of Lee's choices. And while her choice and her decision-making was a personal and a private process shared with her closest family, Lee was also public about her plans. When the time came, and she didn't know exactly when that would be, but when the time came, she would manage her own death. That's the phrase she chose to use to describe her actions, and she would argue with anyone who would suggest that this was anywhere in the realm of suicide. She was clear that was not what she was doing. Manage her own death, facing towards it, not away. She methodically researched options. That information is out there in the world. She gave attention to how her choice might impact her family and her community. She made her decisions in relationship with her adult children, not seeking their approval so much as informing them, bringing them along, gaining their assent. In the end, at the age of 90, still without any form of terminal diagnosis, living in a body that was weakening and a mind that was beginning to forget in significant ways, she made it clear that when the time came, she had decided she would stop eating and drinking. So 5 springs ago, Lee was living at home, and one side of her body had weakened so much she could barely use it. And she found herself facing that reality. She might fall and lose her autonomy, lose this thing she had spent decades cultivating. In June of that year, I heard from a mutual friend it was nearly time. Like so many of folks in her outer circle, I made an appointment to bring dinner to Lee. Each of us did this knowing that we were bringing food, but mostly we were there to talk with her. She was still eating, but didn't have much hunger at this point. What we were doing was intentionally having our last conversation, a much bigger goodbye than the one Dan was talking about before. Lee took delight in the gift of knowingly having a last conversation. She said it was one of the best things about being public about her decision to manage her own death. That was the same summer that in my ministerial formation, I was a hospital chaplain intern. And Lee grew up as an adult, she was a teacher, and she was a teacher at heart, not just by profession. And so I asked her, because I knew she would say yes, I said, would you like to meet with other students, other chaplain interns? They would learn so much from you in your conversation with death. And she said, absolutely. So we showed up, 7 of us, the supervisor and 6 of us, from different faith traditions, to sit and talk with her in her living room and ask her what it was like. And the best part of this was that 3 of us were asking questions, and 3 were like, I don't know, deer in headlights. They didn't quite know what to do with this. And she chided them. You have this opportunity, why are you quiet? Ever committed to teaching and public witness of encountering death without fear, or what she would call superstition, right, her humanist side, the year before, she had taken part in a community dialogue about death that she really had initiated. She had been interviewed by a local newspaper reporter, also a Unitarian Universalist, about her ideas and her plans, and engaged in a frank community dialogue that was published in 2013. You can still find it online if you look. But by late August of that year, Lee had stopped seeing friends, and she was doing what she said she planned to do. She stopped eating, and she stopped drinking. Surrounded by her 3 adult children, moving towards death, Lee invited, and her children said yes, that same local newspaper reporter and a photographer to be present, to record in word and photo the process of her dying and her death, which took place on September 2nd, 2014. The narrative and photo narrative was published to much praise and much condemnation. We have, and I think you know this as a society, for the most part, hidden death away. So when a person like Lee, or a journalist, or a newspaper decides to stop hiding, strong feelings erupt. Still, I know it was a gift. Not many of us are ready for death. I am not ready for death. But it does not much matter, our readiness, our assent. Death comes. Wise people tell us that if we live our lives knowing that we are going to die, that we are in many ways already dying each moment, that our lived lives will be fuller and more precious. It is a hard lesson to take in. It is even harder still to practice, but our very lives depend on it. While you or I might not make the same choices Lee made, I invite you to consider the invitation her choices extend to us all, to bring intentionality to our lives by bringing intentionality to our deaths, to hold conversations with those nearest to us, perhaps someone in this room, perhaps even with strangers, to engage in a process of discernment about what the end of life, about what the end of your life looks like, and then share what you learn with those nearest and dearest to you. While some say to contemplate death is a morbid preoccupation, what I have found to be true is that there is a way for such ruminations and meditations to be enlivening. So let me close with another UU voice who has blessed us with reflections upon her own death. The Reverend Nancy Schaefer was diagnosed with a brain tumor, which eventually and far too soon took her life on June 5th, 2012. Nancy kept a journal with the intention of having the reflections published, which they were, under the title, "While Still There Is Light." So these are her words. "This is not lost on me. Given that I have a tumor that, I am told, will someday kill me, I also have the advantage that I must now reflect, while I am alive, on the meaning of my life and how I want to leave it. I might have died quickly. This is harder, perhaps, but exquisitely richer. I get to grieve for my own self. How tender and not to be missed is this. May each of us be more able to face death, that of our loved ones, even our own, to know peace and ease and perhaps even a little bit of the curiosity of Mary Oliver's Hummingbird. Amen, and blessed be. Let us sing together, rising in body or spirit. Our closing hymn is number 6 in the gray hymnal, Just as Long as I Have Breath.